You may recognize Michael Fearon on the other screen from a previous interview. He is trained as an architect in Australia, and he teaches emergency management at Ryerson and is very knowledgeable about these topics. Welcome back, Michael.
Yeah, thank you for having me back again.
Now, just before we began, as they would say in the green room in television, we were talking about why you went to Australia to study emergency management in architecture. And I think it's a very interesting point, whether someone studied before 9/11 or after 9/11, and whether that person studied in America with all the Homeland Security and FEMA funding or outside America. Could you talk about those demarcation lines a little wee bit?
Well, yeah, I can talk about that from my personal experience, and what I found is, well, at the time when I was going or just getting into disaster management, it was just around the time of after 9/11. And pretty much what I found is a lot of the American programs were focused on and concept of what I would describe as adversarial emergency management, where you have somebody, either a terrorist attacking or an active shooter entering a premise of a building. And because funding was available at the time, and that was it's right after 9/11, terrorism was the new buzzword in both Homeland Security and also in disaster management. I found that the United States' programs had that focus, whereas in the case of Australia, where I ended up going to, the focus was on built environments and how does the built environment influence your preparedness towards disasters. And that's why it was an interesting combination of looking at the architectural aspects of what is a built environment, what is it that we create in these environments, and how does the things that we create relate to the actual environment, and how does that promote resiliency or detract from our own resiliency. The fun one I like to always think of is an igloo is an amazing survival house in the Arctic, but you would never build an igloo in a desert. And it's just thinking about that idea of often we construct environments that don't necessarily match the natural environment, and how does that affect disaster preparedness?
I think you could start building an igloo in the desert, but you'd never get it finished.
I think so too. I think you'd get pretty close. If you really wanted to, I think there's a technology probably to have instant freeze on the inside, but it's never going to last. You're just fighting nature at that point.
And there's only one entrance and exit, which would be contrary to fire codes.
Oh, yes, definitely contrary to fire code.
But the serious and tragic manifestation of your interest in the built environment is, of course, the shirtwaist factory fire in New York, where female garment workers leapt out of the fire escapes because doors were locked, and there was one stairway to nowhere, as I recall. Yeah. And all those tragic fires in theaters, the Laurier Palace, the Iroquois Theater in Chicago, in which hundreds and hundreds of people were killed, and in Quebec, children were not allowed to go to a movie until age 16 because of that tragic fire in Quebec, and then all kinds of industrial accidents. So yeah, that was part of your focus?
That was part of my focus. Me personally, as I was going forward, I was really looking at that time, I had a real fascination in working in developing countries and dealing with how education programs work in disasters, and looking at how you restart education when that doesn't exist in a community after disaster. And the reason why I was looking at that is greatly because if you can't create a sense of normalcy in the community, people are receiving training or learning and so on, what ends up happening is you eliminate your entire workforce's ability to enable the recovery. People can't go back to work because they're watching their children. People that are in the middle of training programs never finish and end up losing that capacity for the nation's future into the building. And the other aspect of that was really looking at how agile project management could actually be useful in a disaster, for providing small testing projects in a dynamic environment, and using some of the tools used in the IT field to attempt to use it in a disaster so that you could more rapidly engage people at risk and better enable recovery.
Well, in this pandemic, are we launching into some sort of lost decade with a whole bunch of people not finishing their education or certifications or exiting a business such as the restaurant business and really taking many years or perhaps the rest of their entire lives to get back on their feet?
The honestness of the scenario is we're facing something that no one's ever done. We've shut down a large portion of the economy, and the service industry makes up a massive part of the Ontario economy, the global economy. And the service industry is not simply the restaurant that you think of the Tim Hortons drive-through. We also get into individuals that are engaged in the retail aspect of the service industry, of being able to talk and show you new merchandise. Right now, malls are barely full. You can walk around one, it's nowhere near what it used to be. And you can see just stuff really, and no consumers for it. So we have a really spillover economy that's going to be taking amazing reskilling, amazing future program development and leadership to pull us out of it. And the transition process from this to ensure that we don't end up with a lost decade is going to take massive reskilling. It's going to take real motivation on the part of policy and so on to come up with ways of getting people not just engaged into any job they can find, but also thinking of a future scenario or what our society should look like for employment into the future. But those are all debates that I think are very philosophical and yet to be decided, but I think that's where we should be thinking about.
Yeah, huge debates, and maybe the silver lining is the so-called gig economy, which is not actually great news. Young people working short-term contract to short-term contract for low wages, but that doesn't involve going to an empty mall. Michael, I'd like one more thought on the FEMA funding and terrorist focus of American emergency preparedness. There's at least some thought that that focus caused America to be so flat-footed on Hurricane Katrina and other weather events that they weren't really prepared for what Perot might call normal emergencies that happen all the time, every season. Do you agree with that thesis?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that thesis. I think it's part of, if a lesson I would take away from it for everyone, for general life, is I think we often fight our last battles. And the last battle that the United States had been traumatized by at the time was the 9/11 terrorist attacks and the attacks on the Pentagon and the attacks on the World Trade Center. And in the case of these events, these are horribly traumatic events for the United States. Largest civilian losses on American soil since World War II eras, and even before that. So it's a really personal national trauma that it experiences. And as a result, its response to disaster management is from that context of its trauma. As a result, the funding, the availability of resources was all put towards preventing that from happening again, or avoiding feeling that trauma again. But in doing so, it left the country vulnerable to other natural disasters that are much more frequent and much more likely, such as Hurricane Katrina, such as the flooding that also happened when the levees broke. So what you often find, I think, it's not only the United States' case, but I think for any nation or any group engaged in disaster management, we have a tendency to really look at the last thing that was traumatizing to us, or we perceived as very bad, and put all of our effort into planning only for that scenario because of the memory of what happened and not being able to see other real serious risks.
Let me challenge you on that just for a second, because that's exactly what the average citizen does. We don't focus on the 50,000 people who die every year on North American highways, or the roughly 50,000 who die from regular influenza, because those events are dispersed over time and space. But the one bus crash with the Humboldt Broncos hockey team in it, or 9/11, of course, in one spot, making the news, amplifying the risk, what Roger Kasperson would call the social amplification of risk, makes one focus on a unique and specific and maybe even highly unusual event. But I would challenge the emergency response community, not politicians, not journalists, not the average person, but the emergency response community, to look beyond that and not be so influenced as if they were just an average citizen watching cable news. Why didn't the emergency response community look back to the 4 pandemics that we've had, or epidemics that we've had, including Hong Kong flu, including 57? Now, many might be too young, but they're not constrained by merely watching cable news. They could read the academic literature on this.
Yeah, I do think for the modern emergency management, yes, looking way beyond the scope of what is the attractive thing at the time is really useful, is important. At the same time, I think the challenge that I think many people face is most programs are dictated by funding availability. So you get into this interesting case where at the political level, where funding allocations are decided, pretty much goes, okay, we need programs that meet X, Y, Z objectives for whatever reason. They may be nearsighted or farsighted. That's up for political commentaries to discuss. But all of a sudden, you end up with programs conforming to follow these objectives. I'm not saying that people lose sight of the larger scale concepts. Pandemic discussions were still important in the era of the terrorism-focused disaster management because of the fear of anthrax. So you could see there is a little bit, or tools usable for pandemics in that toolbox, but that wasn't necessarily the focus. It wasn't thinking that the pandemic was just naturally occurring necessarily. It was maybe an adversary was bringing that up as a focus or creating it. But, you know, it's still a pandemic plan, so it's kind of there. So I find that you get into that kind of issue of funding will always push the narrative of the planning aspect and will kind of, in some cases, overwhelm some of the great far-sighted programs that could really address some of these issues.
Well, more challenges for you, and perhaps a little off topic, and I didn't warn you we were going to get into this area, but it is great to get your reaction. Number one, on the funding issue, let me suggest that there may be no shortage of money. One statistic I recently heard was that only 20% of all funding for American biodefense actually got into biodefense, and biodefense includes the pandemic. It includes regular influenza, and I've often quipped after 9/11, terrorists would be better off spraying aerosol canisters of regular influenza all over malls than planning a high-tech attack. That would disable a lot of people for a while. So that funding is being diverted to regular research or other activities, or maybe even furnishing offices. It's not getting to actually where it's needed.
I would definitely imagine so. My personal opinion on funding allocations is always the stuff that always needs it. The people working on it are often so focused on just keeping the day-to-day open that they often don't have time to look for other additional opportunities, and opportunities sometimes go unused. And if only there was a better way for everybody to go, like there's free money here, come over here, that would be great. But
now here's another statistic, and just for fear of sounding like I'm being too hard on the emergency management community, which maybe deserves a second look or a critical look these days. I've recently found that there are 500,000 procurement officers in the state, local, and federal governments in the United States, and many of those actually sit in on pandemic planning meetings and emergency planning meetings with governors. They sure didn't procure what was needed. And again, I find it hard to believe that the state of California, with probably a bigger budget than Canada has and about the same population, couldn't afford to procure extra masks, or even an individual city or a hospital couldn't. I don't know what I want you to say about that. I just want you to react, because it really is shocking.
Well, I have to check on that one. I believe that the issue was with how the United States was bidding for its masks, and pretty much they ended up with the states competing against each other instead of a unified approach to procurement. And that could have ended up in a lot of weird issues of them being unable to acquire things that they really should have been able to. But that's a matter for our American procurement. I think it's amazing that they weren't able to do it, or at least rapidly re-equip part of their supply chain to do it, similar to what Ontario was actually doing later on as we started putting distilleries towards making hand sanitizer. And anyone who was in the manufacturing industry that could retool their supply or their equipment to make useful medical equipment or mask or anything were slowly shifted over for us here in Ontario. But I'm surprised that that kind of visioning wasn't done in parts of these states. At the same time, not an expert on the United States' full issues for why they weren't able to do some things that would be expected for a particularly wealthy country.
Just as a thought experiment, Michael, I think partly it's just-in-time delivery and the supply chain. And we had similar challenges in Canada, where I think just before the pandemic, we threw out thousands of personal protective equipment devices that had outlived their usefulness. I think, for example, with a mask, the elastic goes brittle and will break. So this is just garden variety poor inventory control, it seems to me. And if you had, as sometimes broadcasters used to joke, the average county clerk from Moose Jaw or someplace said, well, how many days supply do we have of this stuff? And if it was too short, you would stockpile more. Well, I guess that's all going to be resolved in what the military call the hot wash-up after this pandemic, and we will see what everybody says about it. Michael, I've diverted our attention from some personal preparedness. Let me just get one or two sentences from you. I think we should have a longer conversation on this. Mm-hmm. But I'm speaking to you from the 26th floor of a building in downtown Toronto. And whether it were a co-op, an apartment, a condo, or an office building, I would like your perspective from your architectural training on what we should have on hand in this building to keep us a little safer, because there's no way some of us are going to walk down 26 flights of stairs. I happen to use that as my exercise, so I will be able to. Yeah. But there is documented evidence that we just don't have a plan for people with mobility challenges or respiratory ailments. Well, what's your top of mind thoughts on the individual staying safe in these big buildings?
Top of mind is, number one, do exactly what you're doing. Practice walking down those flights of stairs. I know there's often a tendency. I have friends that live in several downtown condos, and the practice fire alarm will go off, and they'll kind of be like, they're just testing again. Just going to ignore it. I'd recommend, if you're able, definitely practice walking those flights of stairs. Get into the habit of knowing what that's like. If you have mobility issues, the number one thing that I would recommend that make sure that you have a system of is nearly have a building buddy system. Similar to in corporate buildings, you have the fire warden that checks the floors because some people might choose not to leave during an emergency. You need to know where they are. So it's more of a documenting of you are here, and also that person being responsible when they get to out of the building, because they're able to walk out. They're informing emergency services that this person's at this location, especially if you're unable to move or get out. And after that, it's getting into remembering some of the basics of fire safety. Remembering to soak the towel, stick it under the door to prevent smoke from getting in. Some of those very basic items that kind of went over back in grade school, but it's always useful to review at this point. And just making sure that you have, if you're going to be sheltering in place, have the necessary supplies for you to shelter in place for a prolonged period. So those are some of the items that I would definitely recommend if you like yourself are on the 27th floor of a building and you have to do something.
Michael, thank you very much. I think that we should come back in a few weeks and have a complete discussion on preparedness in the home and in the office for either sheltering or evacuation. But in the meantime, good thoughts, and thank you very much. And I guess I should say, stay safe.
Yeah, thank you very much. Great for having any discussions, and you too, stay safe.
Pleasure.